good. So I want to think about churchyards as commonplaces in the mid-18th century, and specifically in the poetry and also the scholarship of Thomas Gray. As Alex mentioned, the kind of question I'm always find myself returning to is with literary writers who are also scholars, how do those two things relate to each other or not relate to each other? And that's today's kind of thoughts are an extension of that larger question, I guess. I'm going to begin with something that William Wordsworth wrote. I can't get away from Wordsworth, so I'm going to start there. This is from one of his essays upon epitaphs. And the claim of Wordsworth's that I'm interested in kind of tracing back through Gray is this one. So Wordsworth wrote, "An epitaph is not a proud writing shut up for the studious. It is exposed to all. It is concerning all and for all." I think this is the best articulation of a particular way of thinking about churchyards that partly originates in Gray, although also elsewhere. It takes me, at least, right back to what's probably, James might challenge me on this one, but the most famous churchyard in 18th century literature, and that's the churchyard of Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard, which was first published in 1751. So Gray's Elegy, as in much of Wordsworth and many other writers of the period besides, churchyard is characterized as a place where anyone at all can go to read history. So it's not just an open location like a village green, say, but also a kind of open book. You can see on the screen now is a copy of his elegy that Gray wrote out in his own book, and all of the images that I share are from that Alex mentioned, this book that I produced last summer. And that's freely available through the Cambridge Digital Library if anyone is curious enough to go and have a search and go and have a look. So in Gray's Elegy, as many of you will know, the poet starts by describing a churchyard in the evening, and he then begins to imagine the lives of the people who are buried beneath its mounds and tombstones. And the lives that the poet reconstructs in the poem are imaginary. He uses the word perhaps several times when he's speculating. The knowledge is that the tombstones give you very little information in any case, sometimes only names and dates. And this is how Gray puts it in the poem. He says, "Their name, their years, spelt by the unlettered muse, the place of fame and epitaph supply." Nonetheless, it's really interesting to me that it seems to have been important to Gray to think about the lives that he describes in the elegy as histories rather than fictions. For example, so he compared them with historical individuals such as Oliver Cromwell, and most significantly, I think, he also aligns them with a genre of history writing. He calls them the annals of the poor. So Gray knew exactly what he was doing when he used the word annals. The historical method was something that he devoted himself to in his life. Gray spent much more of his life, in fact, on scholarship than on poetic composition. His scholarly interests were extremely wide-ranging. He was attached to the University of Cambridge for much of his life, first at Peterhouse, then Pembroke College, and eventually as professor of modern history, and he made very good use of its scholarly resources. He made notes, many of which have survived, on books that traversed British, European, and global fields of knowledge, ancient and modern. Obviously, that included literature, but also geography, philosophy, law, religion, politics, music, visual art, natural history, architecture, and history. And as well as reading very extensively, he also used practical research methods. So he translated from ancient and modern languages, for example. He inspected ancient and modern buildings. He analyzed musical performances. He assembled scientific data, he preserved specimens, and he made notes on collections of paintings. Like many 18th century scholars, he did not publish any of his research at all, but he had a significant influence nonetheless on contemporary intellectual life by sharing his learning through correspondence and manuscript circulation, as was extremely common at the time. And what you can see on the screen now is just one opening from the extensive antiquarian essays that he wrote in his Commonplace book. And these are chiefly it's a 3-volume Commonplace book in folio. It's absolutely massive. This is chiefly from the second half of the second volume and the beginning of the third volume as well. In these antiquarian essays, Gray assembled historical and textual information about British tombs, cathedrals, churches, houses. Many of the essays information gathered from tombstones, and he used the information gathered from tombstones to reconstruct the histories of the people they commemorated. And in fact, the long section that begins on this opening that I'm displaying on the screen is entirely devoted to tombs. So you can see the Latin section heading Sepulchra up in the top left-hand corner. So just to explain what you're kind of seeing visually, Gray's habit in his Commonplace book was to write continuous prose on the left-hand side of an opening and add footnotes that are not footnotes on the right-hand side. So they're kind of side notes rather than footnotes. So on the left-hand side, the continuous prose, you can see, it might be too small to make out. So, but I will tell you, please trust me, he's describing here the tomb of Robert, who's the son of William the Conqueror. And it's quite a good example of how Gray used tombstones to reconstruct history. So he's making deductions about Robert's biography on the basis of the tomb's appearance. For example, he notes that Robert must have been a crusader because his effigy has its legs crossed. In the notes on the right-hand side, he's using other material evidence to work out when the tomb had been made. For example, there's a point there about halfway down where he queries the authenticity of the heraldry that's painted onto the effigy, because other tombs and objects such as coins have told him that hereditary arms were not used until the time of Richard I, so much later. Now, I think it's quite important that Gray is basing all of this reasoning on publicly available information. So he's not using what Wordsworth would call proud writing shut up for the studious, but a tomb that's exposed to all, and in fact, it's in front of the altar in Gloucester Cathedral. What this means is that Gray's method as an antiquarian scholar was surprisingly akin to the method that we see in his elegy. So he's reconstructing histories from tombstones left in public places. There's a couple of caveats that I want to make to that association. The first, and I think this is really important, Gray's antiquarian tombstone research is not a source for the elegy. He actually writes the elegy first, quite many years prior, nor is the elegy an inspiration for his study of tombs. I think what we're seeing here is a kinship in method that shapes the poetic composition and the scholarly activity, but they're undertaken separately, and neither is primary to the other. And the second caveat I'd want to make is that there are some really important differences between Gray's historical research and the histories that he reconstructs fictionally in the elegy. The most significant is that the elegy's churchyard is rural and the histories reconstructed from it are unknown and working class. And in contrast, the histories that Gray reconstructed from tombstones in his antiquarian research were always noble. And in fact, you might be able to make out the subheading on the left of the screen after the section heading Sepulchra. Gray's beginning here with the monuments of the royal family. Very different. It can be tempting, therefore, I think, to think of this kind of scholarship, this aspect of Gray's life, as an elite activity that's available to him because of his educational privilege. So Gray studied at Eton College, then at Cambridge, and through these institutions, he made lifelong friendships with gentlemen scholars, including Horace Walpole, son of the Prime Minister. Gray's background was a bit more complicated than you might expect, given his education. His mother ran a milliner's shop, raised him alone, having escaped his abusive father, and Gray only went to Eton because his uncles taught there. Also, and more importantly, I think, most of the libraries in Cambridge and in London where Gray studied were public, as were the churches and cathedrals and churchyards where he undertook antiquarian research. More broadly speaking as well, 18th century antiquarian scholarship was not usually an elite activity anyway. In fact, it was often mocked for being shabby and unfashionable, not what a gentleman should do. Gray himself mocked it in those terms. That's partly because many early 18th century antiquarians had been non-jurors, that is, people who'd refused to take the oath of allegiance to William of Orange after the Glorious Revolution, and therefore had lost their positions in church and society. Non-jurors were often refused access to key research resources like Oxford and Cambridge College libraries, royal collections, and the private collections of aristocrats. And that meant that for quite a long time, antiquarian scholarship had been unusually reliant on common access to sites such as churchyards, as well as on collaborative communities for sharing books and manuscripts. As Wordsworth observes, 50 years later, churchyards are a kind of archetype for that sort of resource, not a crowd writing shut up for the studious, but exposed to all. So I want to suggest that that openness was as important to Gray as it was to Wordsworth. And the final connection that I want to make is to Gray's Commonplace book itself. I think in Gray's Commonplace book, he found some really fascinating ways of incorporating openness and common access into the very organization of his scholarship. So when Gray, as a young man, began filling this enormous Commonplace book, one of his first entries was a short summary of John Locke's new method for compiling a Commonplace book. And you can see that entry, it's titled Adversaria, on the screen now. Before Locke's system became popular, most people who kept a Commonplace book would organize the material that they copied into it under established headings or places. And these were usually written into the blank volume in advance. These are large generalizations, there are many exceptions, but it did mean that the topics covered in a Commonplace book, by and large, were fairly well established, and they usually related to moral and religious topics, which meant that the material copied into Commonplace books was often didactic. Locke's system made many changes to that established pattern. It meant that the compiler of a Commonplace book did not have to use established headings or write them into the volume in advance and then fit their entries into pre-allocated spaces. And instead, when using Locke's system, compilers could make entries sequentially, just one after the other as they occurred to them, and devise their own headings, which meant compilers could include notes on any topics they liked under any heading they chose. So, in Gray's case, notes on tombstones under the heading sepulchra. One effect of Locke's system was to make Commonplace books more useful for the pursuit of specialist research. So a Commonplace book could now accommodate material on any subject at whatever length and level of detail the compiler preferred. But the risk, of course, is that Commonplace books would no longer have anything in common with each other. When you're using established headings to construct a Commonplace book, then different Commonplace books can be shared and compared. Commonplace books that followed Locke's method were unique to each individual and therefore potentially harder to search. Locke had a solution, of course, and that was indexing. So Locke suggested that compilers should add the page number of each heading that they came up with to an alphabetic finding aid that was organized by initial letter and subsequent vowel to enable universal information retrieval. And this is Gray's version of that index. This is the finding aid that Gray produced for guidelines, his own book. In the first volume, as a young man, and he kept adding page references to it over several decades as the Commonplace book grew through 3 folio volumes. Finding aid meant however much Gray's Commonplace book expanded and whatever new specialist research topics he became interested in, its information remained retrievable. It does today. That means that, like the tombstones read by the poet in Gray's elegy, tombstones that he wrote about under the heading sepulchra in his Commonplace book are, to use Wordsworth's words one last time, I promise, not a proud writing locked up for the studious, but exposed to all.